up, Lizzie? I'm serious, Stubby. I just giving myself a minute to start. My phone's gonna die. How have I been? I've been great, man. Alright. Wait, let's go ahead and start. It's 12:32. Alrighty, boys. This is so stupid. Mike's low. Hold up. Is this better?
That has to be better, right? It is. Alright, let's go. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. We're not even a minute in. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I hate you guys. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. How many minutes in are we? I need someone to check. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I'm actually already losing my mind. Like I think I'm saying the wrong word. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Your anal hit 1K. Congrats. All right, I gotta focus up. I'm just driving around now. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Hey, 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 no self-promo. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I love you, Stubby. No. Subscribe, because I have to let everyone do it. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Do I really have to restart? Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Time out, time out. Do I really have to restart? Wait, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Alright, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh god. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Michaela, I need a charger. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I don't think I'm pronouncing it right anymore. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Yes. There also should be one downstairs. Get the one from downstairs. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. What do I do when I get a PlayStation guy? He's gonna be hella mad. Subscribe, 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 oh, subscribe, 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 don't subscribe, 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 subscribe.
When you're yelling from his mother extra lines,
subscribe, 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 subscribe.
Hey, that's karma. You probably just broke your stupid headphones.
Subscribe, subscribe.
No, that's gonna hurt, please.
Go.
That's freaking gonna hurt.
Subscribe, subscribe. They can't hear you. Subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. What? Go! Subscribe! Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Who this dude? Who are you? Who this man? Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Oh no. Subscribe, subscribe. subscribe, 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 subscribe. Ooh, I subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 copyright, subscribe, 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 guys. Alright. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe.
60 seconds left on the clock.
Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oops, I'm sorry, Dolphins. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I didn't mean to do that, Dolphins. Subscribe, 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 sure, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh, I don't play Fortnite like that anymore, bro. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I'll make a deal. If someone donates $1, if someone donates $2, I'll restart the timer. Subscribe, 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 Subscribe. 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 I'm done? Is it true? Did anyone donate the $2? We may be alive. Let's win this game. Did I gain any subscribers? Should I do an hour of subscribe and like up the stream tomorrow? Everyone's like, no, just no. So usually when my viewers say no, that means yes. Yes, hell no. Okay, so what you guys are saying is I shouldn't just subscribe and like up the stream, I should just do subscribe again. But for an hour. 24-hour, who can say subscribe longer challenge, Mr. Beast. That's how I'm gonna do the giveaway when I get the 50 followers on Twitch. I'm gonna say whoever can say subscribe to It's AJ Boom on YouTube longer, and whoever the last two standing are, they'll win the gift cards. They will win the gift cards. Teacher, shut up! No way he shut us up, right? Bro, I'm literally impaired right now, just like, not like that impaired, but like physically impaired because of that. $10 gift card of your choice, or I can just PayPal you the $10. GG, bro. Then you can win it. Oh my god, my phone's gonna die. Did I get MVP? I don't know how. Jesus Christ, stopping. No help. Alfie. Is he a rapist or the atheist? Oh, the ape is here. Neither. Aldrin! Did you subscribe? I would think you're cute if you did. Alright, bro. Ow, my toe! Alright, guys. Like, my head hurts and that, and all that shit. Link, please. Rickroll him. Dolphin always just rolls. Alright, stream. Y'all can talk later. I'm going to bed. Good night, stream.